In the autumn of 1857, something happened in Little Rock, Arkansas, that the local authorities buried so deep it took over a century for whispers to surface. On Thanksgiving night, in what was once the grandest plantation house in Pulaski County, a slave named Samson supposedly killed his master with his bare hands, snapping Colonel Jeremiah Ruttle's neck like a dry twig. But here's what makes this story different from other tales of slave rebellion. Witnesses claimed Samson's strength that night was inhuman. Strong enough to crush a man's skull with one hand, bend iron tools into pretzel shapes, and leave handprints pressed so deep into oak beams they're still visible today. The official records were sealed, the witnesses silenced, and the entire incident scrubbed from local newspapers. What really happened on Ruttled Plantation that Thanksgiving? And why did 3 separate county officials spend the rest of their lives claiming that what they saw that night defied all natural explanation? Before we continue with the story of Samson and the secrets buried beneath Ruttled Plantation, if you're fascinated by these forgotten chapters of American history, hit that subscribe button, my channel Black Right Stories, and tell me which country watched, because tonight's tale might be closer to your hometown than you think. The story begins in the heart of Arkansas Territory, 20 miles south of Little Rock, where the Arkansas River carved its lazy path through some of the richest bottomland cotton country in the South. By 1857, Ruttled Plantation had grown to encompass over 3,000 acres, worked by nearly 200 enslaved souls who lived in the shadow of Colonel Jeremiah Ruttle's imposing Greek Revival mansion. Ruttled himself was a man of contradictions, a Massachusetts-born lawyer who'd moved south in his 20s, drawn by the promise of easy wealth in cotton speculation. Unlike many plantation owners who were born into the system, Ruttled had chosen it, and perhaps because of that choice, he ruled his property with a methodical cruelty that shocked even his neighbors. He kept meticulous records of punishments, maintained detailed breeding charts for his human property, and was known throughout Pulaski County for his scientific approach to slave management. The enslaved community at Ruttled Plantation lived in 2 distinct quarters, the field hands in rough-hewn cabins near the river, and the house servants in slightly better accommodations closer to the main house. It was a world of whispered conversations, hidden knowledge, and survival strategies passed down through generations. The older slaves spoke of better times under Ruttled's predecessor, a gentler man who'd sold out when the colonel arrived with northern capital and southern ambitions. Among this community, Samson stood apart, not because of his size, though at 6'4" and he towered over most men of his era, but because of his strange history. Rutledge had purchased him 3 years earlier from a bankrupt plantation in Louisiana, and the bill of sale listed unusual details: strong constitution, unusual physical capabilities, possible medical anomaly. Buyer assumes all risks. The seller, a Frenchman named Budrow, had been eager to part with Samson, despite his obvious value as a field hand. Samson never spoke of his previous life, but the other slaves noticed things. He could work 16-hour days in the cotton fields without showing fatigue. He could lift cotton bales that normally required 2 men. His hands, when examined closely, showed calluses so thick and developed they looked almost like horn. The plantation blacksmith, an enslaved man named Jupiter, swore that Samson could bend horseshoes with his bare hands, though he was careful never to display such abilities where the overseer might see. But it wasn't just physical strength that set Samson apart. There was an intelligence in his eyes, a literacy carefully hidden that suggested education far beyond what any slave was permitted to possess. Late at night, some claimed to see him scratching symbols in the dirt outside his cabin. Not English letters, but something else entirely, something that looked almost like formulas. Colonel Ruttled took a particular interest in Samson, though not out of kindness. The colonel had heard rumors about the slave's unusual capabilities, and saw an opportunity for both profit and scientific inquiry. Ruttled fancied himself a man of learning, a subscriber to phrenology journals and agricultural periodicals that discussed the natural variations in human specimens. He began conducting what he called strength assessments on Samson, timing his work, measuring his output, and documenting his capabilities in leather-bound journals kept locked in his study. These sessions took place in the plantation's old carriage house, away from prying eyes. Rutland would have Samson lift increasingly heavy objects, anvils, tree trunks, even sections of iron machinery while he took notes and made calculations. The colonel was particularly fascinated by what appeared to be Samson's ability to work without fatigue, often pushing him for hours beyond the point where normal men would collapse. By autumn of 1857, these assessments had taken on a darker tone. Rutland had begun inviting guests to witness what he called his demonstrations, wealthy planters from neighboring counties who came to see the slave who could allegedly perform feats of impossible strength. Some of these demonstrations involved lifting contests. Others required Samson to bend iron bars or break thick wooden planks with his bare hands. But as Thanksgiving approached, something began to change in Samson's demeanor. Other slaves noticed at first a tension in his movements, a distant look in his eyes, as if he were calculating something. Jupiter, the blacksmith, later told investigators that Samson had begun asking strange questions about the plantation's layout, about Colonel Rutland's habits, about which of the house servants had access to which parts of the mansion. The Rutland household was preparing for what the colonel planned to be his grandest Thanksgiving celebration yet. He'd invited over 40 guests from as far away as Memphis and New Orleans, including several who'd specifically requested to see his remarkable specimen. The menu had been planned for weeks with special delicacies ordered from as far away as Baltimore. Most importantly, Colonel Rutland had planned a special after-dinner demonstration featuring Samson, one that he promised would astound his guests and cement his reputation as Arkansas's most forward-thinking plantation owner. What Rutland didn't know was that Samson had been listening. The house servants, moving invisibly through the mansion as they prepared for the celebration, had overheard conversations about the planned demonstration. More disturbing still, they'd glimpsed some of Colonel Rutland's private journals, left carelessly open in his study. The entries they'd seen spoke of terminal experiments and ultimate strength limitations and acceptable losses in the name of scientific advancement. As Thanksgiving Day, 1857, dawned, crisp and clear over the Arkansas bottomlands, both Colonel Rutland and Samson were making their final preparations. Neither man knew that before the night was over, one of them would be dead and the other would vanish into the Arkansas wilderness, leaving behind only questions that would haunt Pulaski County for generations to come. November 26, 1857, began like any other Thanksgiving at Rutland Plantation, but the undercurrents of tension were impossible to ignore for those who knew where to look. By dawn, the mansion's kitchen was alive with frantic preparation as house slaves worked under the watchful eye of Molly Kittenden, the head cook, preparing a feast that would seat 50 guests in the plantation's grand dining room. Samson had been assigned to help prepare the grounds, setting up additional seating on the mansion's wraparound veranda and ensuring the oil lamps were properly filled and positioned for the evening's entertainment. But those who worked alongside him noticed something different, an economy of movement, as if he were conserving his strength for something specific. His usual willingness to take on the heaviest tasks had been replaced by a careful calculation of effort that seemed almost strategic. Colonel Rutland spent the morning in his study, reviewing his notes and preparing for what he'd privately dubbed the grand demonstration. His journals from that day, discovered decades later during the mansion's demolition, revealed his excitement about showing his guests what he believed would be the ultimate proof of his theories about human physical limitations. The final entry, written in his careful script that morning, read, "Today I shall push the specimen beyond all previous thresholds. Science demands nothing less than complete understanding." The guests began arriving around noon, their carriages creating a steady stream along the plantation's oak-lined drive. Among them were some of the most prominent names in Arkansas society. Judge Cornelius Dillingham from Little Rock, plantation owner Samuel Vaughn from Helena, and Dr. Nathaniel Petton, a physician from Memphis, who'd gained notoriety for his writings on racial physiognomy. But the guest who drew the most attention was Professor Emanuel Voss, a German immigrant who claimed expertise in what he called physical anthropology, and who traveled from as far as St. Louis to witness Ruttle's famous slave. As the afternoon progressed and the guests enjoyed their pre-dinner drinks on the veranda, Samson continued his preparations with the methodical precision of a man following a carefully rehearsed plan. Jupiter the blacksmith later told investigators that when he tried to engage Samson in conversation around 3 o'clock, the larger man had looked at him with eyes that seemed to see right through him, as if his mind were somewhere else entirely. The dinner itself proceeded without incident. The guests feasted on roasted turkey, sugar-cured ham, cornbread stuffing, and an array of seasonal vegetables, all prepared by skilled hands, who moved invisibly between kitchen and dining room. The conversation flowed as freely as the wine, with discussions of cotton prices, territorial politics, and the growing tensions between North and South that would explode into war just 4 years later. But as the evening wound toward its climax, Colonel Ruttle stood to address his guests, his face flushed with wine and anticipation. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying over the murmur of conversation, "tonight you will witness something that challenges everything we thought we knew about the limits of human capability. My specimen, Samson, will demonstrate feats that would have been considered impossible just a generation ago." The guests followed Rutledge out to the old carriage house, their voices excited and skeptical in equal measure. Torches had been arranged around the building's perimeter, casting dancing shadows against the weathered wooden walls. Inside, the space had been cleared except for an array of testing apparatus, iron bars of various thicknesses, wooden beams, and what appeared to be sections of railroad iron arranged on heavy wooden blocks. Samson was already waiting inside, his massive frame silhouetted against the torchlight, but something about his posture, the way he held his shoulders, the angle of his head suggested a readiness that went beyond mere physical preparation. Dr. Petton, the Memphis physician, later wrote in his private diary that looking at Samson that night was like looking at a spring wound to its breaking point, all controlled energy waiting for release. Colonel Ruttle began with his usual demonstrations. Samson lifted weights that should have been impossible for any man, bent iron bars that should have required machinery, and split thick oak beams with his bare hands while the guests watched in amazement. Professor Voss took copious notes, muttering in German and occasionally asking Ruttle to repeat certain tests. But as the evening progressed, Ruttle's demands became more extreme. He ordered Samson to lift heavier weights, bend thicker iron, break harder wood. The guests, initially impressed, began to show signs of discomfort as they realized they were witnessing what amounted to systematic torture disguised as scientific inquiry. It was Judge Dillingham who first noticed the change in Samson's expression. Around 10:30, as Ruttle ordered him to attempt lifting what appeared to be a section of railroad rail, something shifted in the slave's demeanor. The careful compliance, the measured responses, all of it vanished, replaced by something that made the judge step backward involuntarily. Colonel Dillingham said quietly, "Perhaps we've seen enough for one evening," but Rutledge, caught up in the excitement of his demonstration and the attention of his guests, waved off the suggestion. "Nonsense. We're just reaching the truly interesting thresholds. Samson, I want you to attempt something we've never tried before." He gestured toward a massive piece of machinery that had been moved into the carriage house earlier that day. The iron flywheel, from a cotton gin weighing easily 400 pounds. For a long moment, Samson stared at the flywheel, then at Colonel Ruttle, then at the circle of expectant faces surrounding them. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that several guests had to lean forward to hear him. "No, sir." The simple refusal hit the gathering like a physical blow. In the Antebellum South, A slave's direct refusal of a master's command was unthinkable. A violation so complete it demanded immediate and violent response. But something in Samson's tone, in the way he held himself, gave everyone pause. Colonel Ruttle's face went through a spectrum of emotions: surprise, anger, and finally a cold fury that his guests had never seen before. "What did you say?" I said, "No, sir." Samson's voice was still quiet, but there was something underneath it now. Something that made Professor Voss stop writing in his notebook and Judge Dillingham take another step backward. "You will do as I command," Ruttle said, his voice tight with rage, "or you'll face consequences that will make our previous sessions seem like gentle encouragement." For a moment that stretched into eternity, the two men faced each other across the torch-lit space. Then Samson smiled, and several of the witnesses later swore that they'd never seen an expression more terrifying in their lives. "No, sir," he said, one final time. "I don't believe I will." What happened next unfolded with a speed that left most witnesses struggling to process what they'd seen. Samson moved toward Colonel Ruttle with the fluid grace of a man half his size, covering the distance between them in 3 impossibly quick strides. Ruttle had time to raise his hands defensively, time to open his mouth in what might have been a shout or a plea, but no time to escape what was coming. The sound that followed, described by multiple witnesses as resembling a thick branch break-eye in a strong wind, would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. Colonel Jeremiah Ruttle, master of 3,000 acres and nearly 200 human souls, died instantly as his neck snapped with an audible crack that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. But it wasn't just the killing that terrorized the witnesses, it was the ease of it. Samson had killed his master with no more effort than a normal man might use to break a stick for kindling. For a moment that felt frozen in time, he stood over Ruttle's body, his massive hands still positioned as if he were holding something delicate that had simply broken. Then he looked up at the circle of horrified faces, and when he spoke, his voice carried an intelligence and education that no slave was supposed to possess. "Gentlemen," he said with perfect diction and a slight accent that none of them could identify, "I suggest you leave now." The stampede that followed was anything but dignified. Prominent citizens of Arkansas society trampled each other in their haste to escape the carriage house, abandoning all pretense of social standing in their panic to reach their carriages and flee into the night. Within minutes, Ruttled Plantation was empty, except for the slaves in their quarters, the body of their former master and Samson, who stood alone among the scattered testing apparatus and flickering torches. What happened in the hours that followed remains one of the great mysteries of that terrible night. The house slaves, terrified and uncertain, remained in their quarters until dawn. When they finally emerged, they found the carriage house empty, the torches burned out, and Colonel Ruttle's body gone. Samson had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed, leaving behind only the deep handprints pressed into the oak beams where he'd demonstrated his strength, and a plantation full of people who suddenly found themselves without a master, without direction, and without any idea what came next. But the disappearance of Samson and the body was only the beginning. Within hours, writers were dispatched to Little Rock, telegrams were sent, and officials began arriving at the plantation. What they found launched an investigation that would consume the local authorities for months and leave questions that remain unanswered to this day. The immediate aftermath of that Thanksgiving night created chaos throughout Pulaski County. By dawn of November 27th, word had spread through the network of plantation owners, overseers, and county officials who formed the backbone of Arkansas society. The implications were staggering, not just because a slave had killed his master, but because of how completely Samson had vanished and how traumatized the witnesses had become. Judge Cornelius Dillingham, one of the most respected legal minds in the state, returned to Little Rock in a state that his clerk described as complete nervous prostration. Dr. Nathaniel Petton, the Memphis physician, checked himself into a private sanitarium and refused to speak about the events for over a year. Professor Voss simply disappeared, abandoning his hotel room and leaving behind only a trunk full of notes written in what appeared to be a mixture of German and some form of mathematical notation that no one could decipher. Sheriff Thomas Briege arrived at Ruttled Plantation at first light, accompanied by a contingent of armed deputies and several volunteer militia members from Little Rock. What they expected to find was a crime scene, evidence of violence, possibly an ongoing slave revolt, certainly some trace of where Samson might have fled. Instead, they discovered something far more unsettling, a plantation where life seemed to have simply stopped. The house slaves, when questioned, provided accounts that were maddeningly consistent and completely unhelpful. Yes, they had heard raised voices from the carriage house around 10:30. No, they had not investigated. Slaves learned early not to interfere in their master's business. Yes, they had seen lights moving around the plantation late into the night, but from their quarters they couldn't determine who might have been carrying them or where they were going. Most frustrating of all, when pressed about Samson himself, the slaves seemed almost unable to provide useful descriptions. He was tall, they agreed. He was strong, certainly, but when asked about his personality, his habits, his relationships with other slaves, they became vague and evasive in ways that suggested either deliberate concealment or genuine confusion about who Samson had really been. Jupiter, the plantation blacksmith, proved to be the most forthcoming witness, though his testimony raised more questions than it answered. Under pressure from Sheriff Bridge, he admitted that Samson had possessed unusual strength far beyond what any normal man should have been capable of. But when pressed for specifics, Jupiter's account became increasingly strange. He could work all day without getting tired. Jupiter testified his hands twisting nervously in his lap, but it wasn't natural tired. You understand? It was like how what his are something different than the rest of us. And sometimes late at night, I'd see him doing things that didn't make sense. What kind of things? Sheriff Bridge pressed. He'd be working with numbers, scratching them in the dirt, but they weren't like any numbers I ever seen. And sometimes he'd be talking to himself, but not in English, in something else. Something that sounded. Jupiter hesitated, clearly struggling with how to describe what he'd observed. Something that sounded like he was giving orders, not just talking, like he was used to being in charge of things. The physical evidence at the plantation was equally baffling. The carriage house showed clear signs of the previous night's activities: scattered weights, bent iron bars, broken wooden beams, but there was no blood despite the violent nature of Colonel Ruttle's death. There were no clear footprints leading away from the building, despite the soft earth that should have preserved tracks. Most mysteriously, there was no body. Sheriff Bridge organized search parties that combed the Arkansas bottomlands for miles in every direction. They dragged ponds, searched abandoned buildings, followed every creek and river in a 20 m radius. But Samson seemed to have vanished as completely as morning mist, leaving behind no trace of his passage. The investigation took on an increasingly desperate quality as days turned into weeks. Governor Elias Conway, under pressure from prominent plantation owners throughout the state, authorized a reward of $500 for information leading to Samson's capture, an enormous sum that drew bounty hunters from as far away as New Orleans and Memphis. Wanted posters appeared throughout the Arkansas Territory and neighboring states, featuring a description so generic it could have applied to dozens of men. Large Negro male, approximately 6'4" in tall, unusually strong build, answers to the name Samson, extremely dangerous, approach with caution. But as the weeks passed, a more troubling pattern began to emerge. Several of the bounty hunters who'd taken up the search reported strange encounters in the Arkansas wilderness, glimpses of an impossibly tall figure moving through the forests at night, campsites that appeared to have been occupied by someone of enormous strength, trees that had been uprooted or bent in ways that suggested superhuman force. More disturbing still were the reports that began filtering in from other parts of the state. A plantat, iron owner near Pine Bluff, reported that his slaves had begun acting strangely, whispering among themselves and showing signs of what he called dangerous excitement. Another planter near Helena claimed that his overseer had quit suddenly after reporting that the slaves were talking about someone called the strong man who was coming to set things right. By Christmas of 1857, the Samson investigation had become something of an embarrassment to Arkansas law enforcement. Despite the massive manhunt, the substantial reward, and the involvement of federal marshals, they were no closer to finding their fugitive than they had been on Thanksgiving night. Worse, the case was beginning to attract unwanted attention from northern newspapers, which had begun running sensationalized accounts of the Arkansas Superman who had supposedly killed his master and vanished into thin air. It was during this period that the first attempts at official cover-up began to emerge. Governor Conway, concerned about the impact on Arkansas's reputation and the potential for the case to inflame tensions between North and South, quietly ordered all official records of the investigation sealed. The reward was withdrawn, the wanted posters removed, and newspapers were discouraged from running further stories about the case. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source, Colonel Ruttle's personal papers. When his estate was finally settled in early 1858, his executives discovered something that had been overlooked during the initial investigation. Hidden in a false bottom of the colonel's desk was a collection of documents that suggested his interest in Samson had gone far beyond simple scientific curiosity. Among these papers was correspondence with several northern universities, including detailed discussions about human experimentation and physical enhancement studies. There were receipts for chemical compounds ordered from laboratories in Boston and New York, substances with names that meant nothing to local investigators, but suggested medical or scientific applications. Most intriguingly, there was a bill of lading from a shipping company in New Orleans dated just 2 weeks before Samson's arrival at the plantation for what was described as specialized pharmaceutical equipment and associated materials. The final document in this hidden collection was perhaps the most disturbing, a contract with a company called Meridian Research Associates based in Boston for what was described as ongoing physiological assessment and enhancement protocols. The contract was signed by both Colonel Ruttle and someone identified only as Subject S in handwriting that several of the house slaves identified as belonging to Samson himself. These discoveries raised questions that no one in Arkansas was prepared to answer. Had Samson been part of some sort of medical experiment? Had Colonel Ruttle been working with northern interests to develop new forms of human enhancement? And if so, what did that mean for understanding the events of Thanksgiving night 1857? The official response to these revelations was swift and decisive. The documents were classified as sensitive estate materials, sealed by court order, and transferred to federal custody. The executives were sworn to secrecy. The house slaves who had identified Samson's handwriting were quietly sold to plantations in distant states, and all mention of Meridian Research Associates were scrubbed from official records. But rumors persisted, spreading through the underground networks that connected slave communities throughout the South. Stories of the strong man who had broken his chains and disappeared into legend. Tales of government experiments and northern conspiracies. Whispers about other plantations where similar specimens might be undergoing similar treatments, and what might happen if they, too, decided they'd had enough. As 1858 dawned over Arkansas, the Samson case officially no longer existed. But in slave quarters throughout the South, in the private correspondence of worried plantation owners, and in the locked files of federal offices in Washington, the questions raised by one Thanksgiving night continued to multiply. And somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Arkansas Territory, those who claimed to have seen him insisted that Samson was still out there growing stronger, biding his time, and possibly planning something that would make his actions at Ruttled Plantation seem like just the beginning. Spring of 1858 brought new developments that would deepen the mystery surrounding Samson's disappearance and raise questions about the true nature of what had occurred at Ruttled Plantation. The first indication that the case was far from closed came from an unexpected source, the Pinkerton Detective Agency, which had been quietly hired by parties unknown to conduct their own investigation into the events of Thanksgiving night. Alan Pinkerton himself arrived in Little Rock in March, accompanied by two of his most experienced operatives. Unlike the local authorities who had focused their efforts on tracking Samson's movements after the killing, the Pinkertons were interested in what had happened before his arrival at Plantation. Their investigation would uncover a trail that stretched back through Louisiana, Mississippi, and eventually to a series of medical facilities in the Northeast that had been conducting what they euphemistically called human improvement research. The Pinkerton investigation began with the original bill of sale that had brought Samson to Arkansas. Detective James Hawthorne, posing as a potential slave buyer, traveled to Louisiana to interview original seller, the Frenchman named Boudreaux. What he discovered was deeply unsettling. Boudreaux's plantation, deep in the bayou country south of New Orleans, had once been the secret site of disturbing medical experiments carried out under the name the Southern Health Initiative. Officially, the program claimed to study diseases common among enslaved people. In reality, it was something far more dangerous. Behind closed doors, they tested chemical compounds and experimental medical procedures designed to push human strength beyond natural limits. In a confidential report to the Pinkerton Agency, Hawthorne wrote, "The Frenchman grew uneasy the moment I mentioned Samson's name. He insisted he had disclosed every known risk in the bill of sale and claimed no responsibility for what followed. But under pressure, he admitted Samson had been part of what he called the enhancement protocol for over 2 years before being sold." According to Boudreaux, the initiative was funded by a group of northern investors eager to create more efficient labor systems. Their experiments involved chemical exposure, rigid exercise programs, and what they described as nutritional optimization. Most subjects showed only minor improvements in strength and stamina. Some displayed dramatic changes, but a rare few, like Samson, began to exhibit abilities that seemed to go beyond normal human limits. And then came the side effects. The enhanced men became harder to control. They questioned authority. They showed unexpected intelligence. Some developed sharp reasoning skills that unsettled their overseers. Samson stood out above them all. Within months, he taught himself to read and write. Soon after, he grasped complex mathematical concepts. He began asking dangerous questions about the treatments, about their purpose, about the system itself. In 1854, the Louisiana experiments ended abruptly after a revolt. Several enhanced subjects escaped, and 3 overseers were killed. Most of the escapees were recaptured and quietly eliminated. But a few, including Samson, were sold off to distant plantations, accompanied by carefully worded warnings about their unusual characteristics. The investors believed they had buried the truth. They were wrong. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another powerful historical story. Your support helps us continue uncovering the secrets history tried to hide.